For more than 4 centuries, a lie has hung silently on classroom walls, in libraries, in boardrooms, and in the very maps we grew up trusting. A lie so subtle that most of us never questioned it, yet so powerful that it shaped how the entire world saw Africa. That lie was the map itself. The familiar Mercator projection, a 16th-century tool of empire, shrank Africa down to a fragment while inflating Europe and North America into giants. It told us that Greenland could rival Africa in size when in truth Africa is 14 times larger. This wasn't an innocent mistake. It was a psychological weapon of colonial power crafted to make one continent appear mighty and another look weak. But today the African Union has broken the silence. With one bold declaration, it has ripped off the mask of cartographic deception and told the world the truth: Africa is vast, beyond measure 37 million square kilometers, a colossus large enough to swallow the United States, China, India, and half of Europe with space left to spare. The AU's decision to endorse the Correct the Map campaign is not just a correction of lines and shapes. It is a correction of history. It is a revolution against the quiet chains that for centuries have belittled an entire continent in the eyes of its own children and in the calculations of global powers. And I ask you this: how would you feel if the map you trusted since childhood, the one you saw every day in school, turned out to be a deliberate lie designed to keep a people small in your imagination? Wouldn't you feel betrayed? Wouldn't you demand justice? This is the moment Africa has chosen to rise and reclaim its true image. Leaders like Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traoré have sparked this awakening, demanding dignity and truth, not just for Africa, but for the world. So stay with me, because in the next few minutes, you'll see why this single act, redrawing a map, could shake the very foundations of global power. Please share if you feel you are one of the first to stand with this awakening, and subscribe if you believe that truth matters more than headlines. At the heart of this story lies not just a map, but a centuries-old deception that has shaped the very psychology of the modern world. To understand why the African Union's declaration has made such waves, we must return to the year 1569 when Flemish cartographer Gerardus Mercator introduced his famous map projection. Designed for maritime navigation, the Mercator projection made one crucial choice: it stretched the areas near the poles while compressing those near the equator. For sailors, it made plotting straight lines across oceans easier. But for humanity, it carried a devastating side effect, or perhaps, as some argue, a devastating purpose. On every schoolroom wall across Europe and America, Africa began to look small, almost insignificant. Greenland, a frozen landmass of barely 2 million square kilometers, appeared to rival Africa, which in reality covers 30.37 million square kilometers. Europe, a continent of 10 million square kilometers, loomed disproportionately large beside the African giant. The Americas appeared dominant, while Africa shrank into a footnote. For centuries, this visual distortion infiltrated textbooks, newsrooms, and political thinking, and for centuries few questioned it. This is why the African Union's endorsement of the Correct the Map campaign marks such a turning point. On its official social media platforms, the AU shared a striking new image: the Equal Earth projection created in 2018. Unlike the Mercator projection, Equal Earth depicts continents in their real proportions, balancing accuracy with visual familiarity. On this projection, Africa towers over the world, a massive, undeniable presence its true size revealed. The post went viral. The AU's caption thundered: Africa's true size is 30.37 million square kilometers, or 11.73 million square miles. Our continent can encompass the United States, China, India, the United Kingdom, Japan, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and Portugal, and still have space to spare. For millions of Africans scrolling through their phones, it was a moment of revelation, of visceral shock. Hashtags like Correct the Map and An Africa Awakens exploded across TikTok, X, and Instagram. Young people stitched videos showing side-by-side comparisons of Mercator and Equal Earth, and their voices carried the anger of generations. Why were we lied to? Why did they make us small? Journalists soon picked up the story. Reuters quoted AU Deputy Chairperson Selma Malika Haddadi, who said it might seem to be just a map, but in reality it is not. Her words cut to the core of the matter. This wasn't about geography alone. It was about psychology, identity, and dignity. Maps, after all, shape the way we imagine the world. A continent drawn smaller is a continent perceived as weaker in politics, in trade, in culture. The AU's decision, therefore, was not cartography. It was geopolitics. Supporting this stance was Moki Makura, executive director of African No Filter, one of the campaign's leading voices. She called Mercator's projection the world's longest-running misinformation campaign. In her words, it was not simply an error, but a deliberate distortion that justified centuries of colonial domination. Shrinking Africa on maps made it easier to shrink Africa in treaties, in investments, and in international imagination. The visual proof was perhaps the most powerful. In the AU's shared image, Africa stood as a giant swallowing within its borders outlines of the United States, China, India, and a dozen European nations. It was a visual gut punch, as one commentator described, a reminder that Africa is not marginal, but central, that it is not small, but colossal. For older generations, the revelation stirred anger, decades of textbooks and atlases filled with lies. For the youth, it sparked pride. Social media became a battleground of truth where Africans and allies alike demanded that global institutions abandon the Mercator projection once and for all. Even Google Maps was called out, "Fix your app, stop shrinking Africa." This was the event itself, not a war, not a coup, not a natural disaster, but something quieter yet perhaps just as revolutionary. A map correction, a truth unveiled, a step toward reclaiming the dignity of an entire continent. And while the Mercator projection may have been born in the 16th century, its shadow reached into the 21st. That shadow at last is being burned away. If the revelation of Africa's true size was the spark, then the global reaction was the fire. The African Union's bold stance did not land quietly. It roared across the world, igniting debates in classrooms, rattling news anchors, and sending powerful institutions scrambling to explain why they had clung to a colonial-era distortion for so long. The climax came with the image itself. On AU's official page, Africa stood massive, dwarfing the combined outlines of the United States, China, India, and half of Europe. The caption was blunt. Africa's true size is 30.37 million square kilometers. It was not written as an academic note, but as a thunderclap, a direct challenge to centuries of deceit. For many Africans, it was the first time they saw the scale of their homeland expressed with unapologetic pride. And for many in the West, it was a shock they could not easily dismiss. Almost instantly, the hashtag #JacquesCorrectTheMap surged. On TikTok, young creators overlaid music with side-by-side animations, Greenland shrinking Africa expanding to its rightful form. On X, African users mocked Western arrogance. So the continent that feeds you, fuels you, and supplies your minerals was never small. It was your ego that made it so. These posts were shared millions of times. What had once been a niche conversation among geographers became a viral, unstoppable movement. But the reaction did not stop at social media. Institutions were put on trial. The United Nations geospatial body received a formal request to adopt the Equal Earth projection. The World Bank, long accused of perpetuating neo-colonial mindsets, announced it would phase out Mercator for all new reports. Even Google Maps, which had quietly shifted to a 3D globe view on desktop back in 2018, faced backlash for still showing Mercator distortions on its mobile app. Fix it, demanded users worldwide. The pressure was relentless. And yet, amid the finger-pointing at Western institutions, another uncomfortable truth emerged. Africa's own leaders had been complicit. For decades, they stood on international platforms, accepting aid-signing exploitative contracts and parroting Western narratives, all while the maps behind them made their continent look smaller than it truly was. The AU's bold move exposed not just colonial arrogance, but also African complacency. Citizens began asking hard questions. How could our leaders with satellites and technology at their fingertips pretend not to know? The anger was not abstract. It was deeply personal. Teachers began posting online confessing the heartbreak of realizing they had unknowingly passed on the lie to generations of children. Parents spoke of showing the Equal Earth map to their kids and seeing their eyes widen with wonder. One father wrote, "My daughter told me, Papa, Africa is a giant. Why did they lie to us?" I had no answer. International media scrambled to catch up. The BBC aired a segment on the controversy, though critics noted its defensive tone. American outlets like CNN framed it as a symbolic debate, downplaying its significance. But African voices pushed back. This was not symbolic, it was existential. As AU Deputy Chair Selma Malika Haddadi reminded reporters, "It might seem to be just a map, but in reality it is not. And then came the ripple effects. In universities from Lagos to Nairobi, student unions called for all textbooks to be replaced with equal Earth projections. In Europe and America, diaspora communities amplified the campaign demanding recognition of Africa's rightful place. The conversation leapt from geography to geopolitics, from perception to power. Through it all, one name kept surfacing: Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. His fiery speeches, already viral online, had been calling out the AU for its silence long before this declaration. He had warned that Africa's dignity was being eroded not only by economic exploitation, but by psychological warfare lies embedded in the very maps children saw. Now, with the AU finally acting, many credited Traoré for pushing the organization into courage. His leadership was seen as catalytic, the spark that forced even cautious bureaucrats in Addis Ababa to stand tall. The climax of this saga was not just in the exposure of the lie, but in the reactions it unleashed: shame in Western institutions, fury among African citizens, defensiveness in media circles, and pride swelling in the hearts of young Africans. For the first time in centuries, the cartographic playing field shifted, and with it the narrative of an entire continent. This was more than a revelation. It was a confrontation. Africa had looked the world in the eye and declared, "We are not small. We never were. It is you who made us so, and we will not be diminished again." The shockwaves of the African Union's decision did not end with viral posts and news headlines. They seeped into classrooms, parliaments, and everyday conversations across the continent. What began as a correction of a map quickly grew into a movement for dignity, education, and accountability, with consequences that could reshape Africa's political and social landscape for generations. For ordinary citizens, the revelation was deeply personal. Parents who once hung Mercator maps in their living rooms now replaced them with equal Earth posters, proudly showing visitors the continent's vastness. Teachers began rewriting lesson plans, eager to teach students the truth about their homeland. In Senegal, one headmistress was quoted saying, "For years I stood in front of a map that told my children they were small. Now I can finally tell them the truth: you belong to a giant." Across Africa, children grew up with a new sense of pride, no longer seeing their continent as a shrunken afterthought, but as a colossus central to the world. This shift in perception carried profound political implications. Citizens started demanding more from their governments. If their continent was this vast, this resource-rich, why were so many still living in poverty? If Africa could hold within its borders the United States, China, India, and half of Europe, why did African leaders still act like beggars on the international stage? These were not abstract questions. They were pointed, angry, and directed squarely at those in power. Corruption, once hidden behind the smokescreen of dependency, now looked like betrayal. For decades, many leaders signed lopsided contracts with foreign corporations, allowing Africa's gold, cobalt, lithium, and oil to flow outward while their people struggled. But the exposure of the map distortion stripped away the excuses. Citizens began connecting the dots. The same mindset that shrank Africa on paper also shrank its voice in boardrooms and summits. It was not just geography that had been manipulated, it was politics itself. In the halls of the African Union, debates grew sharper. Member states, once reluctant to challenge Western dominance, now felt emboldened. Calls for curriculum reform, textbook replacement, and new cartographic standards swept across ministries of education. Civil society groups launched campaigns demanding that every African child be taught using the equal Earth projection. For them, this was not cosmetic. It was about identity, about ensuring the next generation grew up knowing their worth. But the political consequences stretched further. Opposition parties across the continent seized on the issue, accusing ruling elites of having tolerated psychological colonization. Protesters in Nairobi and Accra carried banners reading, "We are not small. Stop treating us small." The slogan captured both the spirit of the movement and the anger at political systems that had for too long played into Western narratives. And then there were the leaders who embraced the moment, turning it into a mandate for change. Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traoré once again became the emblem of this awakening. His speeches, already filled with fiery rebukes of Western manipulation, now gained new resonance. Citizens saw him not only as a defender of sovereignty, but as a defender of truth itself. Other reformist voices, such as Rwanda's Paul Kagame, joined the call for Africans to reclaim their narrative, this time not only in economics and security, but in the very maps that defined their world. The civil consequences were equally striking. Art collectives began designing murals of Africa's true size painted on city walls from Lagos to Johannesburg. Universities launched Decolonize the Map workshops linking geography to psychology, history, and power. Even diaspora communities in New York, Paris, and London held rallies with the Equal Earth projection as their banner. The movement transcended borders, becoming a global reminder that Africa could not be diminished any longer. In essence, the AU's endorsement of Correct the Map triggered a domino effect, new pride among citizens, sharper demands for accountability from leaders, curriculum reforms in education, and a broader political debate about Africa's place in the world. What looked like a simple change of projection turned into a profound confrontation with centuries of manipulation and an insistence that Africa's story must now be told on its own terms. This was not only about correcting the past, it was about shaping the future, a future where Africans, seeing their continent as it truly is, refuse to accept anything less than the respect, justice, and leadership their size and potential demand. While Africans celebrated the revelation of their continent's true size, the rest of the world, especially the West, found itself in a deeply uncomfortable spotlight. For the United States and Europe, the African Union's declaration was more than an academic correction. It was an indictment. It forced them to confront a 450-year-old lie that had quietly served their interests, shaping global hierarchies of power and perception. In Washington, analysts debated whether the AU's move was symbolic or substantive. Some officials dismissed it as a minor issue, a matter of maps and visuals. But others recognized the danger. If Africans could successfully challenge even the psychological tools of colonialism, what would stop them from challenging the financial, military, and diplomatic systems that still bind them? For U.S. policymakers, the Correct the Map campaign was a warning sign of a broader awakening, one that leaders like Ibrahim Traoré were helping ignite. European reactions were equally tense. The BBC and other outlets reported on the controversy, often framing it as a cultural debate. Yet African commentators pushed back fiercely, pointing out the hypocrisy of Western media. How could organizations claim to stand for truth and justice while continuing to use maps that perpetuated lies? In Germany and France, where Mercator's projection had long been defended, as traditional intellectuals began to admit that tradition could no longer justify distortion. Beyond embarrassment, there was fear. The geopolitical implications were clear. If Africa began to see itself as vast, powerful, and united, it would be harder to exploit, harder to manipulate. Investors who once underestimated African markets would need to reconsider. Diplomats who treated Africa as a junior partner would face a bolder, more assertive counterpart. And ordinary Western citizens, many of whom had never realized Africa's true scale, now questioned what else they had been misled about. The reaction was not purely defensive. Some voices in the United States, particularly among African American communities, embraced the AU's move with pride. Churches, cultural centers, and Pan-African groups held discussions linking the distorted maps to the broader history of racism and marginalization. For them, correcting the map was part of correcting history itself. As one community leader in Atlanta put it, "If they lied to us about Africa's size, what else did they lie to us about?" The question resonated deeply, tapping into a wider mistrust of Western narratives. Even global institutions were forced to respond. The World Bank began shifting its maps, the United Nations Geospatial Committee received formal petitions, and tech giants like Google faced mounting pressure to align their platforms with the Equal Earth projection. Each concession, however small, was seen as a victory for Africa and a loss for those who had benefited from the distortion. Most telling was the silence of some Western leaders. Unlike in previous decades when Africa's protests could be ignored, this one was amplified by social media. Millions of posts, millions of voices made silence look like complicity. For the first time in living memory, Western governments found themselves unable to dictate the terms of the debate. The narrative belonged to Africa, and the world was listening. In this sense, the AU's move became a mirror for the United States and its allies. Would they continue to cling to outdated distortions, or would they acknowledge the truth and adjust their policies accordingly? That question remains unanswered. But one fact is certain: Africa has declared its size, its dignity, and its power. And the world, America included, can no longer look away. For centuries, the world looked at Africa through a lie, a map that shrank a giant into a child that made a land of unimaginable richness appear weak and fragmented. That era has ended. With one bold stroke, the African Union has declared the truth, and once truth is spoken, it cannot be unsaid. The Mercator projection may still hang on walls, but its power is broken. The deception is exposed. Yet here lies the warning: correcting a map is not enough. If this awakening stops at symbolism, then the sacrifice of generations who endured exploitation will be in vain. The real battle is ahead, in schools, in parliaments, in boardrooms, in the hearts of African citizens. Will textbooks change? Will leaders demand fair contracts for Africa's minerals and farmland? Will corruption finally be uprooted so that Africa's size in geography becomes Africa's size in dignity? Or will old patterns return with a new map but the same submission? The West is watching nervously, but more importantly, Africans are watching their own leaders. And here figures like Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traoré embody the question of our time. He has challenged, silenced, demanded dignity, and forced institutions like the AU to act. But can his vision, and the vision of a continent united in truth, endure? Will Africa rise under leaders who serve their people, or stumble under those who serve themselves? For the United States and its allies, the message is equally clear. Africa is no longer the small, pliant figure drawn on old maps. It is a giant awake. To ignore this shift, or worse, to resist, it is to risk standing on the wrong side of history. Just as the Mercator map has been exposed, so too will every structure built on exploitation. And now, dear friends, the question comes to you. If you grew up believing those maps, if you trusted them, how does it feel to know you were deceived? Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's reform strategies are truly effective in rewriting Africa's destiny? Or should Africans seek new leaders to carry the torch forward? This is more than geography. It is about truth, dignity, and the courage to face uncomfortable history. Africa has spoken, and the world must listen. Please share this message if you feel you are among the first to witness and support Africa's awakening. Subscribe if you believe that the truth matters more than the headlines. The time for lies is over. The time for Africa is now.